Yeah, great.
All right. Father, we just do pray, God, that you just would guide Will, and just the technology would work right, and that you'd be glorified through this presentation. We would see our God who loves us and gave his life for us. We'd see him more clearly as the creator of all things, and that through him, they're all held together. So, Lord, we just pray your blessing on Will, and we just give you this time in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So we will have slides, but if any of you want to move closer, that's just great. And I'm going to turn this rock around for the moment. And so my computer broke last night, and I didn't get to edit this quite as well as I would have liked to. And so I'll begin. Sounds good? This is Surtsey Island off the south coast of Iceland. And like most of the other islands around it, it's covered with grass and wildflowers, small bushes, and lichens and some moss. In the summertime, there'll be about a dozen different types of songbirds that can be found here on Surtsey Island. It's also the home to, at times, thousands of seagulls and other North Atlantic coastal birds that will nest there. And thank you. And it's got, I'm going to go back one, basalt cliffs, that'd be hardened lava cliffs that drop into the ocean, and lots of sea life around them. It's got both gray and black sand beaches, and in some areas orange and white. And it's got multicolored rounded rock beaches. Now, Surtsey Island is younger than I am. It was formed by a volcano in 1963. But, if most of us went there and we weren't aware of that, we would take it for granted that Surtsey, if we're not thinking biblically, that it might be hundreds of thousands or millions of years old. That's what our society tries to ingrain in us. And this is true all over the place. But we'd be wrong. Now, this rock right here is from the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. And maybe you can see that there's thin, dark, and light layers in this rock. And when I went to WSU, I was taught that those form from different winter-summer cycles or different strong storms. During the late spring, summer, and early fall, there'd be leaves washed in with the sediment, and the carbon in the leaves would stain those layers dark. And they wouldn't necessarily form every year. I was taught that it would take, at a minimum, hundreds and probably thousands of years for this thickness of sediments to build up. But if you look at it, there's a fern frond going through all of it. There's the stem of the frond at a shallow angle, and there's leaves up and down, going up and down from that stem. And before that stem could tip over, let alone rot, all those layers washed into place. And we know now from experiments at the University of Colorado and studying Mount St. Helens and storms that a current will separate in a somewhat repeating pattern. Whoosh, all those layers are washed into place. Whereas even today, most geologists, most scientists are thinking that each one of those lines is a separate current flow. And I've got other rocks up here. This is another one from, let's see, I'll advance the slide here, from the Appalachians. And on one side of it, it's got the impression of the trunk of a tree. And, but on the back side, it's got, is that the side? Yeah, fine layering of black and red and gray. And throughout all these rocks, there's leaves and pieces of wood and pieces of root that are scattered all through this sediment. And then on this side of the rock, right here, let's see, that'd be over here in the picture, there's a horsetail reed. And today, in most of the world, a large one's the size of my index finger. In a little bit of South America, I know of some that can get to be about this size, like 1.5 inches in diameter. But even then, they're hollow, they're segmented, they're not strong like bamboo. The walls of these green chlorophyll filled walls of the stem of the plant, that'd be the word, are just like less than 1/8 inch thick. And but here again, this rapid sediment buildup around these things before they can rot. So it's really rapid, that's what I'm trying to say, and it's not the way most people are thinking. Now this is from in Washington, this upper one, and here up on Blewett Pass, fine layering in shale. And you'll notice part of a small branch that's preserved right in the midst of it. And this one's from near Wenatchee. But it's got the impression of 2 different tree ferns, just beautifully preserved right in there. But this fine layering and flowing the direction the plants were lying. They were oriented the direction the water was flowing. And they were buried by the world flood. So there's lots of evidence all over the place that shows us that what is commonly being taught at museums and schools and many books and movies is not correct. Now let's look at the Bible some. Whoops, wrong. Oh, forgot this one. Mount St. Helens, many of you are familiar with this. 25 feet of fine layering, mud flows a couple months after the 1980 eruption. So this wasn't by the volcanic eruption itself. This was mud flows a couple months later, but 25 feet of fine layering in a single weekend. Okay, on to the Bible then. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So, very clear, 6 days God's done everything. I mean, this is beyond amazing. But not for God. This is in Exodus, and it's in the 10 Commandments. And it's God talking to us about the Sabbath, especially the Jews. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. For in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them, but rested on the 7th day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So, here again it's reiterating this concept that God did all the creation in 6 days. The 7th day was special, a day He rested and set an example for us. And then, how do we arrive at the age of the earth? Biblically, we look at the genealogies, right? And so here are some of the genealogies. You'll notice Noah here, one of his sons, Shem, and this would be Shem's sons here. And then it says in Genesis 11:11 that he had other children after this. I'm not sure why these ones are separated out. And then some of their descendants, even leading over to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob there. Japheth, same thing. Next slide. Ham. Next slide. Okay, and so it gives both from creation, so we're looking at Adam, and that would be year 0, dating from creation, and then how old they were when the first son that's being talked about is born, and then how long they lived. So Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. And so from that, we can arrive at the year of the world flood, the year when many things happened. Next slide. From the birth of Jesus, so this would be, this is 2023, but From the birth of Jesus till now, more than 2,000 years. In Luke chapter 3, it says there's 55 generations from Abraham to Jesus and 20 generations from Abraham to Adam. And the world flood occurred 1,656 years after creation. All you here know that many cultures in the world and the Bible, I shouldn't say many, several cultures in the world and the Bible talk about people living to be several hundred years old. And so, Noah lived to be over 900. And Noah was still alive when Abraham was born. He wasn't in the same part of the world, but he was still alive when Abraham was born. But we can date lots of events in world history. Now, next slide. And there's theological issues involved. The wages of sin is death, both physical death and spiritual death. Christ was without sin. He came as a man, lived among us, was tempted in every way, yet was without sin. That's why he could die in our place. Now, if death isn't a result of sin, if death has been going on for hundreds of millions, billions of years, we find T-Rex bones with cancer in them. And there's and evolution is a story of death and birth defects and survival of the fittest, right? But the Bible says, for since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. And there's these spiritual issues because death really did come as a result of sin. Next slide, please. And it says in Romans that the creation is groaning in chapter 5. It's subject to decay, corruption, damage, and it's groaning in waiting for the sons of God to be revealed when Christ returns. So now, the world flood. So there's been major events that have happened in world history that the Bible talks about. For one thing, in creation week, God lifted up the continents out of the oceans. A lot of sediment would have moved around, and this was before there was life. So we would expect to find some sedimentary rock with no life in it, and we do. And then it says God sent this world flood, not capriciously, but it says that the hearts of the people of mankind were exceedingly wicked all the time. That's why he sent the world flood, to destroy mankind from the face of the earth and start over with not a perfect family, but a family that Noah and his family were largely trying to follow God, especially Noah. And so he sent tremendous rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. It caused tidal waves. That's not right. It caused flash floods and flooding. Next slide. Tremendous flooding. Next slide. Next slide. And he also had the fountains of the deep. All of them broke open, burst forth. So these huge underwater geysers were erupting. This is a huge geyser in New Zealand erupting. It's not a volcano, it's a geyser erupting. And it doesn't erupt that big nowadays, but it used to be these tremendous explosive eruptions. A lot of times, volcanoes are functioning as huge geysers, and the main thing they're erupting, sometimes the only thing they're erupting is boiling water, erupting from steam pressure. And next slide. And then that created, so when these bigger fountains of the deep erupted and volcanoes, they caused earthquakes and tsunamis like hit Japan and Indonesia. Next slide. And they caused, this is one main wave, but there was eruption after eruption going on during the world flood. Next slide. Tremendous devastation, eroding the continents, knocking down the forests, eroding the jungles, drowning the life. So we have fossils all over the world, in thousands of feet of sedimentary rock, Next slide. And very few human remains, but there are some. This is a child's jaw found 600 feet underground in coal in Italy. It's not supposed to be there according to evolution, but this child was buried by the world flood. This is in the Carbon County Museum in Montana. Carbon County is called Carbon County because of all the coal there. And there's a molar in that chunk of coal, I'm sorry it's not a better picture, that is now iron pyrite, fool's gold. That's the mineral that's replaced the tooth. But, and even if it's not from a person, just being from a large mammal, it's not supposed to be in that coal according to evolution. And many artifacts made by people, not many, several. This is a hammer found along the Llano River in Cretaceous limestone with lots of dinosaur and ocean fossils in central Texas. And I know of many other things found in coal. I know of a human skull found in Eocene rock in Peru. None of these things, so a gold necklace in coal from Illinois, a bell in coal from West Virginia, an iron crucible in coal from Oklahoma. I have photographs of most of these in the museum. Carved wooden throwing spears in coal in Tennessee, and separately a human skeleton in coal in Tennessee. It says all the highest mountains under the entire heavens were covered. In Psalms it reiterates this. The waters stood above the mountains. And this is talked about, the Salish Indians here in the Northwest talk about this. This is talked about all over the world. And that this flooding water deposited the sediments. As water spreads out, it spreads out by gravity. It spreads out those sediments flat. And so some of you have been to the Grand Canyon, and there's little or no erosion between the layers in the canyon. And erosion can happen fast or slow, but where that erosion is missing, you know that one layer was deposited on another in a short period of time. At the very bottom of the canyon, there's layers from before the world flood, but most of the layers in the canyon are from the world flood. There's also not bioturbulation. That's where if it's on land, tree roots are going down and gophers are burrowing and blurring the edges. If it's in the ocean, it's burrowing clams and burrowing shrimp. It's all really crisp. And next slide. So all these really flat deposits were from the world flood. Now, next slide, please. In Psalm 104, it says that late in the world flood, the mountains rose and the valleys sank down. So this is in the Canadian Rockies, and those are sedimentary layers, just like in the Grand Canyon. But as the mountains rose, they bent and folded and tilted these layers and pushed them to the top. And so all over the world, the highest mountains either have these sedimentary layers from the world flood with ocean fossils in them and fossil ripple marks, or sometimes the granite rocks have pushed through and the sedimentary layers are tilted on the sides. So this is the fossil of a squid with a shell from Tibet. This would be like a chambered nautilus, even more like a paper nautilus, two types of squid that are alive today that have shells. And it's been, has some silver around it. It's been made into part of a necklace. But, all over the world, in the Andes, the Alps, the Himalayas, there's fossilized ripple marks and these ocean creatures that are high in the mountains, sometimes at the very tops. Next slide, please. And then, right at the end of the world flood, a lot in the world changed and the Ice Age started. And that's a separate presentation, but the world flood is actually what triggered the Ice Age. It wasn't cold temperatures. It's cold enough in Siberia right now for an Ice Age to be happening in parts of it, but one's not happening because there's not enough snowfall. And I'll explain that. And the sea ice didn't develop until the big layers of sea ice until late in the world flood. Next slide. And then there was the Tower of Babel. Now, we don't know that this was the Tower of Babel. This is the ruins of a large ziggurat in Babel. I actually have questions whether this is the actual Tower of Babel or not. I don't know. But ziggurats all over the world that were temples, not just burial tombs, really spread, as many of you know, got their foundations and are inspired by the same reasoning, demonic deception that caused the people to build this tower to become like God, not to worship God, but to become like God. Next slide. And the people spread out all over the world. And the Bible, of course, identifies the places the people came from. I said that wrong. As they left Babel, which would be in what we call Iraq, and went to their different places where they settled, the Bible identifies many of them, and it's almost, in fact, I know of no case where it's not what the people themselves say. Next slide. China's another example, and their earliest dynasties, when looked at properly, go back, the same with Egypt, to shortly after the Tower of Babel. Next slide. Now, this is a geologic column like you might see in a textbook. It's from a textbook. And it's talking about, all these hundreds of millions of years. Next slide. Same thing. How do we know this isn't true? Next slide. So there's been this tremendous, so as Pastor Jason was saying, the geologic column you see in textbooks exists almost no place in the world. Very few places can it be found. Many places, most places, a number of the layers are missing. Many places they're in a different order. Now sometimes evolutionary geologists can legitimately explain that because of overthrust, because of plate tectonics. And these are not overthrust, these are thrusts. But where layers that were deeper got, so let me do it this way. Layers that were deeper got pushed or folded on top of the layers that were deposited after them. And there are places there really were overthrusts. And anytime they're out of order, an evolutionary geologist will just assume an overthrust has occurred. Next slide, please. This is one of these big folds. Now, it hasn't tipped over, so it's not an overthrust, but there are places, there are folds that have tipped over and put the layers in a different order. Next slide. And then tremendous folding that occurs some places. And this is actually evidence of the rapid formation of the rocks and they're being bent when they were still somewhat soft in some cases. Not all. Some they're already hard. Next slide. But there's places where there was no overthrust. The layers were just deposited in a different order. Now, if there really was an overthrust, and these layers from the world flood typically go for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And now there are some layers from other catastrophes, large regional floods, or small catastrophes like volcanic eruption, avalanche, local flooding, but most of the layers are from the world flood. And if there really was an overthrust, there will be a source layer that matches this layer they think is out of place. It may be 60 or 200 miles away, but it will exist. And there'll often be evidence of sliding or of a fold that tipped over. And so that was in the Franklin Mountains near El Paso, and there, what would be very low on that geologic column you see in textbooks would be Ordovician. This is what's really there, and it's on top of, so that'd be like trilobite fossils. It would be trilobite fossils, and early trilobite fossils, according to evolution, on top of dinosaur fossils. And there was no overthrust. So any one of these destroys the theory of evolution. Next slide, please. This would be in northwest China and Qinlan Shan. And next slide. And here you've got Ice Age mammal layers. Well, let's start here. Ice Age mammal layers with trilobite fossils on top of them, and then Ice Age sand and gravels in the valleys covering both. And there was no overthrust. Next slide, please. I'm sorry if I... This is important stuff to a lot of people. And bear with me if you can. The Empire Mountains of southern Arizona, layers that evolutionists would consider pre-dinosaur layers. The Permian layers are on top of what they call late dinosaur layers. Next slide, please. Now back to the Grand Canyon. And there's many other examples. Some I'm still researching, but these are ones that are real clear. And one formation that's real noticeable if you've been to the Grand Canyon is the Red Wall limestone, which is fairly, I don't know what it is, half or 2/3 of the way down the canyon. But below the Red Wall limestone, there's this lighter formation is Cambrian, Moab with trilobite fossils. The Red Wall limestone is considered Mississippian with fossils of giant mosses in it. And they go back and forth many times. Now, these layers aren't supposed to be next to each other according to the theory of evolution. There's supposed to be 3 major evolutionary geologic epochs, supposedly 200 million years of layers that are all missing. And these are lying very flat with only occasional erosion, and they're going back and forth many times. Creatures didn't skip steps and evolve and unevolve, skipping all those steps in between. They were alive at the same time, and sediment was washing in from different ecosystems from different directions. And but these just destroy the theory of evolution and this, these ages that they're talking about. Next slide, please. These are fossil bird footprints down in Argentina. Now, we have fossil birds footprints like that from many parts of the world. Have some in the museum from Utah. And up in the northern British Columbia along the Peace River, there's fossil bird footprints just like this. Next slide, please. With dinosaur footprints walking right through them. So here the birds and the dinosaurs are alive at the same time. Now that at face value doesn't necessarily go against evolution. But next slide, please. The bird footprints I was looking at are from Argentina, and they're in Triassic layers according to evolutionists. Now they were evolutionary. They are evolutionary. The geologists in Argentina vehemently defended these layers as being Triassic for about 16 years recently. But they were getting pressure from geologists in many parts of the world because this is before birds are supposed to exist according to evolution. And here's all these bird footprints. And so now they have just recently, in the last couple years, I believe, said, no, we made a mistake. They're Eocene layers. And but that isn't based on any geology at all. It is based on a radioisotope date they got. And somebody like myself who knows radioisotope dating can choose a radioisotope technique and pretty much choose what date they're going to arrive at. And so this is, it's wrong to consider this Eocene. These are Triassic based on the geology. In New Mexico, in the Los Robles Mountains, we have bird footprints. I don't actually have a photograph of the bird footprints, but this is talked about in Smithsonian Magazine and by Jerry McDonald, the main paleontologist at the site. And there's a whole variety of footprints in these Permian layers, which, according to evolutionists, are even earlier than the Triassic layers, before birds or true dinosaurs were supposed to exist. And here's all these bird footprints. Next slide, please. And then, like at the museum, we have 80 or so examples of radioisotope dating showing that it's tremendously off. When we know the age of something, or when we have something to compare it to, we realize, oh, there's something really wrong going on here. Next slide, please. So, freshly killed seals that's a few years old, dating 1,300 years old. Living mollusks that are dated 2,300 years old, but they're not, you know. Next slide, please. Many mammoths, 1 foot to another, 1 foot to the trunk, dating thousands or tens of thousands of years different. But I will bet that everyone in this room, both your feet are the same age. And next slide, please. Living penguins dating 8,000 years old, but they're not. Next slide, please. A single rock from the moon, from the Apollo 16 mission, dated using different radioisotope dating techniques, gave a whole range of ages from 7 to 18 billion years. And none of them are correct, but I'm just trying to, next slide, please. Next slide, please. We'll skip some of these. Next slide, please. Mount St. Helens. So how many of you were here for the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens? Quite a few. Okay, so that was a volcanic ash eruption. Lots of steam and gas coming out with the lava. And so this is pumice, actually from an eruption that formed Crater Lake. And it's lava though, but it hardened flying through the air with lots of bubbles in it. So it's really light. Not all pumice will float on water. That pumice is so light it will actually float on water. So it was lava, and the smaller flakes hardened in the air, and we call it volcanic ash. And this is actually from an eruption on Mount Rainier. But 7 or 8 years after the eruption, I climbed to the rim of the crater, and you could look down into the crater, and a lava dome had formed there that was dome-shaped, and there were big, and it was maybe 300 feet, I'm guessing, below me, and there were big cracks in the crater that were 6 or 8 feet deep, and you could look into the cracks, and they were glowing orange in the bottom. The molten lava was that close to the surface. Thank you. But a rock very similar to this from the 1980 eruption from the lava dome was analyzed by radioisotope dating. The feldspar crystals in the rock indicated that the rock had crystallized about 340,000 years ago, but it should have been about 6. The amphibole crystals in the same rock indicated the eruption was 900,000 years ago. The pyroxene crystals indicated, all in the same rock, the eruption was 2,800,000,000 years ago. None of them are correct. They're not in agreement with each other. They're all tremendously older than the true age. Next slide, please. So let's look at some other ways to put a maximum age on the earth, to figure out how old the earth is independent of the Bible. And some things we can look at is, now you'll notice, so there's the Earth, Venus, Mars. These are by size. Jupiter's moon, Ganymede, Saturn's moon, Titan, and then we get to Mercury. There's 2 moons in the solar system that are bigger than the planet Mercury. Isn't that interesting? And Pluto's way down here. Our moon is considerably bigger than Pluto, which when some of us were kids was still considered a planet. Now it's called a planetoid or something like that. Now Mercury rotates really slowly. It's the closest planet to the sun, but it rotates so slowly that one day on Mercury, one revolution, takes 88 Earth days. And the side that's away from the sun actually gets very cold on Mercury. And it's small in size. And if the solar system were, if Mercury were billions of years old, it would no longer have a magnetic field, but it does. And that surprises evolutionary astronomers, and they don't know how to deal with that. And there's a number of things in the solar system, Saturn's rings, some of the other moons of some of the planets that also this is true of. Next slide, please. Next slide. And another thing is the moon is slowly moving away from the Earth, not fast. So we're not going to notice it in our lifetime. But it's moving a little less than 4 centimeters a year, 1.5 inches a year. It's getting further away from the Earth. That doesn't sound like a big deal. But if we extrapolate back in history, that means the moon was closer and closer. And it means that they couldn't have been together much more than 1 billion years ago. So, but yet, when I was in junior high, there was an announcement over the intercom at school that scientists had discovered that the Earth wasn't 2.3 billion years old. It was actually 4.3 billion years old. And of course, now they've upped it to 4.6 or 4.7. But here we're learning that, it couldn't be more than 1 billion years old. Next slide, please. The moon dust. Now, my father actually worked on the Apollo project, and he helped design the pods, the big discs that were on the base of the lunar landing module of the Apollo 11. He also worked on liquid sodium cooling of rocket engines for the Apollo projects. But for rocket projects, I should say. And it was during the Apollo time. Let's see. But there were estimates that based on what we perceive the amount of dust coming down through space, not from the Earth, but out in space that would settle on a planet or an asteroid or anything out there, including the Earth, and that if the moon were they were calculating it could be over 100 feet of dust on the surface of the moon. That's why they made these big discs. But when they landed there, there were just a few millimeters of dust on the Earth, and they were quite surprised. Next slide, please. At our present rates of erosion, because of just the rivers and rain in the rivers and wind, our continents will erode to sea level in 15 million years. And that's not including huge regional floods that basically all geologists agree on that happened after the world flood. Like here in the Northwest, we had the Missoula flood at the end of the Ice Age, did a tremendous amount of erosion really quick. And there was a huge regional flood in the Southwest. There was one in Alaska, 2 in Siberia, one near the Black Sea, and others that did a tremendous amount of erosion really quick. That's not including times like that. Next slide, please. So now we've got, so that last slide put a maximum age of the Earth at, well, it didn't actually. It said that the continents, 15 million years, they would erode to sea level. And secular geologists actually say that the continents have receded into the ocean 2 or 3 times in the past. That's their way of explaining these fossils at the top of the mountains. Now, I'm going to put another one in between here, the helium in the atmosphere, which is produced by radioisotope decay in the rock. We know how rapidly it's being produced, how rapidly it's escaping into space. It would indicate that the Earth is a maximum of 2 million years old. This is talking about the sun being on fire, tremendous nuclear explosions and chemical burning, shooting tremendous amounts of matter and energy constantly into space. Its diameter has been measured since 1836 by both the Royal Observatory at Greenwich in England and the U.S. Naval Observatory. And all that time the sun is shrinking. Now it does go through a slight expansion every 11 years related to its sunspot cycle, but overall it's shrinking all that time. It would indicate that, so about 5 feet an hour in diameter, it's shrinking that fast. It would indicate that the solar system, including planet Earth, would be a maximum of 20,000 years old. Next slide, please. The Earth's magnetic field is deteriorating at an exponential rate. It's been measured since 1835, and if we plot that data, it's part of an exponential curve. That's a complicated subject, and it's something that none of us, no scientist in the world really understands well. But at face value, it would indicate that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. In this book, Traced, which is a very good genetic study of all mankind, it deals with the findings of several research groups, two major studies, one out of Europe, one out of America, by secular groups focused on the Y chromosomes, and they trace where every people group has separated from another people group, going back to the first man and woman, and all but two of the people groups that I noticed in this book were exactly what the Bible said. Even some people where the people groups said something quite unusual, like one tribe in Africa says they descend from Solomon, as well as one of the major people groups in Afghanistan say they also descend from Solomon. And both those groups, that's what these genetic studies showed. Now there are two people groups that didn't quite match the Bible, but I think as the sample population gets bigger, it will show that they match it as well. But they concluded that there's 3 copying errors every generation on the Y chromosome, and they believe that's true for all our chromosomes. It was just easiest to measure on the Y chromosome. That means our genes were healthier and more diverse further back in history. That both these studies conclude that the whole human population, and these are secular groups, goes back to one man and one woman about 4,500 years ago. And then they say, we know this can't be true. And they say, we don't know, this is our data, we don't know what we're doing wrong, but they're actually correct. And that wasn't Adam and Eve. That was when God restarted the human population with Noah and his wife. Next slide, please. The oldest trees are just a few hundred years younger than the world flood. Next slide, please. Bristlecone pine. Next slide. Giant sequoias. Next slide. The tallest tree in recent history was a blue gum eucalyptus, not a redwood. And it was 411 feet tall, that was felled in Australia in the 1800s. If you've been to the sequoias, some of those trees, 1,200 years old when Christ was born. Next slide, please. Just kind of impressive to think about, Stalactites. You might go to a cave or mine and they'll have a sign there or a tour guide saying that these stalactites took hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of years to form. But the Arizona State Parks have filmed stalactites growing 1 to 3 inches in a single weekend when there's a rainstorm, and I've seen the same thing myself in Southern California, in mines there. And that was under the Lincoln Memorial. And at dams we get stalactites growing, and we have cases where the drip rate is higher, like mines in Australia, and the whole mine is filling in with stalactites. And of course, closer to the world flood, there was more water in the sediments, and the drip rate was faster. And then, let's see. Another question comes up that you might be challenged with. What about distant starlight? It takes, doesn't it take, 1,000,000 light years for some of that light to reach us? And 5 different authors in the Bible, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Job, David, I'm missing one, might be Hosea. They all talk about, in more than 5 verses, there's several in Isaiah, talking about when God created the heavens, the stars, that He stretched out, He spread out. And some of them say it in a continuing sense, that God is stretching out, spreading out, continuing to stretch them out. And of course, Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble Space Telescope is named after, was the first astronomer to realize that it appears, and this made him really uncomfortable, that the majority of the other galaxies are moving away from us, as if we were in the center of the universe, as if Earth had special significance. And so as God created, He created that light, He created all the stars, He spread them out, and that's why we can see starlight from some star that's, the light that's being emitted today, we will never see, except in heaven, But it's because of God doing this at creation. He stretched them out, He spread them out and continued to, and that light was created in transit. And those are some of the verses. Zechariah is the one I was missing. Next slide, please. And then there's other things. It's not, and the solar system, the universe, way bigger than the solar system, is enormous. But there's stuff we don't understand too. There's many photos, especially by a man, Arp was his last name, an astronomer, who got a lot of flack for many years, but now he's like a hero. But where he would measure red light shift of different galaxies, and he found quite a number of them, probably at least a dozen, where there's material bridging two galaxies, but they have very different red light shift, or sometimes very different, but sometimes just somewhat different red light shift values. Now, the red light shift is measuring whether it's going away from us or coming towards us, and how rapidly it's going away. Now, there are problems with it. If the star's emitting mostly redder light, then that throws it off. But either way, these distances are enormous, but there's stuff we don't understand. Next slide, please. That's the end. Okay. And so there's a lot of evidence, if we care to look for it, if we care to look at things honestly, showing that the Bible is just a few thousand years old. Some biblical scientists like myself use the term young earth creationist. And I am a young earth creationist, but I don't like that term because the earth isn't young. It's thousands of years old, and a whole lot has happened in the world's history. But it's not millions or billions of years old. Thank you for listening.